It's wonderful of you to stop by. My name's Victor Takovec, and I hope to keep you around with me. For a little bit of context for this first upload, I made a bet with a wonderful friend of mine that if they wrote a fanfiction of my boy, I would read it on stream. Well, they went above and beyond with that bet, so now we find ourselves here. My first video for this channel being a reading of their second fanfiction. I hope you enjoy, and can use this for background noise to sleep or relax. Also, let me know if there's specific things you'd like to see me read or do in the future in the comments below. Now finally, enjoy yourselves. Everyone knew about superheroes. It was just another part of life, another thing that was taught to little kids alongside the alphabet and basic arithmetic. In this world, some children were very quick at learning how to tie their shoelaces or to multiply in their head. Others could learn how to fly or see through walls. It was just another part of life. The same way that a child could be born with red hair, another could be born with telekinesis. These children, who were blessed with extraordinary abilities, could grow up to be something no others could. Superheroes. If they honed their powers and were strong, smart, or powerful enough to be able to become a true protector of peace and happiness, they might be lucky enough to be picked up by a company and become a true hero. If superheroes with their shiny smiles and uplifting words existed, then the other side of the coin needed to exist just as well. Everyone knew about superheroes, but they also knew about supervillains. People whose sole existence seemed to be dedicated to destroying lives and making people suffer. When children bring their superhero backpacks to school and pretend to save the city from terror and tyranny, on the same day there would be a drill on what to do if the local villains decided to attack the school. How to properly put on a face mask against dangerous gases, or how to warm up your friend if they got stuck in a freeze ray. Normal things for children to learn. Everyone was taught about heroes and villains while growing up. The teachers would explain to kids how villains were bad people, criminals who should be avoided at all costs, while the heroes were the beacons of humanity they should run to if they were in danger. Which ones might make you a little late for work, while the sight of the other could be reason enough for you to send a final message to your loved ones. It was just another part of life. However, life wasn't as simple as they explained in elementary school. Things weren't just black and white. Because if they were, you don't think you'd be currently running around a Walmart, trying to figure out everything you needed to buy based on a note a villain had given you. It started as many things did in life because you needed money. You lost your most recent job after the store you were working at had closed all of a sudden. Your boss had been all apologetic and had explained that it hadn't been his idea, that corporate had forced his hand. Maybe it was corporate's fault, but he still had a shiny new position at a new location while you'd been shown the door. Asshole. Those weren't going to pay themselves, and while you were weighing your options between trying to start a shiny new career and being a sugar baby and going crawling back to McDonald's, an acquaintance had approached you with a job offer. This girl had given you a time and place for a job interview she'd said would change your life. When you typed the address into your phone, and you saw a pretty fucking shady warehouse right by the city's docks pop up, you'd consider blocking the person who suggested that. You didn't even know her that well. She was a friend of a friend you'd met at a social event that you weren't even sure how you ended up at. But then again, at least she wasn't trying to convince you to become an MLM boss babe or whatever. And maybe, if you asked really nicely, the people who were clearly going to steal your organs and sell them on the black market would give you a cut of the money. That's how you ended up doing an interview with the man you were pretty sure was a villain. Maybe. Probably. Even if you were working for a guy you were pretty sure was evil, you would argue that you were a pretty good person. You didn't throw your trash on the floor, you arrived mostly on time when you made plans with friends, and you didn't start fights on the internet. Well, you didn't start fights on the internet too often, and the ones you did start were completely justified in your opinion, and if people didn't have such shitty opinions about life, maybe you wouldn't be tearing them a new one online. Villainy, in your opinion, was like drugs. Growing up, every teacher you had ever met had explained to you that doing drugs was bad, and that you would certainly die if you ever laid your eyes upon any type of drugs. And then while growing up, you realized that, arguably, caffeine and alcohol were their own type of drug. After that, the line was muddled by the idea that weed was slowly getting legalized in more and more places. And then you became an adult, and you realized how many people were doing coke without any concerns for their well-being. Villainy was pretty similar to that. You'd been taught that all villains were evil and cruel, that they were nothing more than despicable criminals who should be shunned from society. Then as you grew up, you learned that jaywalking was a crime, and you started looking away from people down on their luck who had no other choice than taking baby formula without paying for it. Some crimes were definitely still wrong and indefensible, but the line that had been drawn in the sand when you were a child had definitely been erased by the tides more than once. Plus, before accepting the job, you'd done your research on the guy. When you sat in front of him for a job interview, right after he'd shaken your hand and made sure you found the way without too much trouble, he had introduced himself as Dr. Leechborn. "You can call me Victor," he told you with a grin and a wink that made your cheeks warm slightly. Based on the name, you had quickly deduced that while the man was definitely a criminal, he wasn't one of the villains you'd been warned against. Sure, he had probably done things that you wouldn't do personally, and based on the mess you'd seen when you entered his warehouse, this man seemed to be trying to set the Guinness record for the number of OSHA violations in a single place. However, he didn't seem like the type to torture orphans just for shits and giggles. Hell, you'd never even really heard of a Dr. Leechborn before. You hadn't heard a peep about this guy exploding buildings or threatening hospitals for the fun of it. Instead of some supervillain with an overdramatic suit, sitting in front of you was simply a man wearing a crisp white lab coat, smiling at you. You could see tattoo ink peeking out from beneath the white collar at his neck, disappearing beneath the fabric. This man also had an impressive amount of piercings at first glance, and his dual-tone hair was half tied up, probably so it wouldn't be in the way while he was working. Your gaze slid down from his ears, to the bars in his eyebrows, and all the way to the labret piercing at his lips. Almost as soon as you did, a little smirk graced his face, making you look away quietly. If this man ended up being your boss, you didn't want to seem inappropriate the first day. Contrary to what one might expect from a man who introduced himself as Dr. Leechborn, Victor seemed normal. He was polite to you, genuinely nice even. As soon as you sat down at the small place he'd made at his desk, he'd assure you that you were under no obligation to say yes to working for him, and that no retaliation would come your way if you decided to refuse the offer. It was a bit hard to concentrate on his words when the two of you were sitting so close to one another. The scent of jasmine surrounded him, making you relax almost instinctively, even if you knew you should probably be on guard. Still, the man was more polite about it all than most human resources employees you'd met within the past few weeks while trying to find yourself another job. The expectations for the job weren't very clear, but the pay was high enough that you decided to not ask questions. After all, at what other entry position would you be offered $53.45 an hour with benefits? And what wonderful benefits they were, because Victor had explained to you with a beautiful smile that you would be given medical insurance, hazard pay, and sick days. If there was a way you couldn't make it to the job, he'd only ask that you call him in advance to give him a little warning. And please don't lie about why you aren't coming in, darling, he added calmly, because I will know, and I will be disappointed. The warning had left you feeling a bit off-balanced, like you weren't exactly sure what to make of it, but he simply barreled on as if he had said nothing out of the ordinary. You wouldn't really have a dress code, but he did ask you to wear closed-toed shoes for safety purposes. If there was a day he would need you to be properly covered up from neck to toe, he'd inform you of it in advance. Also, Victor drawled as he straightened the papers that were within arm's reach on his desk. While we are at work, I'm going to ask you to listen to what I tell you to do and simply do it. I don't want any questions. I don't want you to think about it. I am asking you to do as I say. You frowned for a moment, staring up at the man in front of you. You weren't a dog that he could simply order around. You knew you had to do the job you were asked to do, but still sometimes it warranted a few questions. As if sensing your thoughts, Victor smiled, shaking his head a little. Listen to me, sweetheart. I work with dangerous materials here. If I ask you to leave or duck and you do not do as I say, it could end up really bad for you. It'd be a shame if you ended up with a scar on that pretty face of yours, now wouldn't it? The comment had made a warmth spread through your chest, rising up over the back of your neck. You had slowly nodded after considering the question for a moment. It was true that you didn't know much about what the man was working on around here. Even if you squinted down at the papers scattered around his desk, you couldn't really understand any of it. While his writing was surprisingly bubbly and easy to read, that didn't mean you could decipher the meaning of the words. You didn't know what potassium nitrate, sulfur, and sugar could do together, but you could see he'd been tweaking the proportions for a few weeks. All right, that makes sense, you slowly agreed with a nod, your eyes still fixed on the formula written out before you. Look at me, interrupted the man, his voice clear and stern. You turned back to look at him almost immediately, blinking up in confusion. Good job, he cooed with a smile, looking at you almost proudly as he handed over the employment contract you needed to sign with the candy on top. Your eyes glimmered at the sight of the perfectly wrapped candy in front of you. This had been your favorite brand of candy when you were young, but as the years went by, it'd been harder and harder to find some. You distractedly wonder how Victor had guessed your favorite types of sweets, but you pushed the thought away, simply happy to have some again. You did discreetly check that the wrap around it was intact before putting it in your mouth, just to be safe. It tasted a bit sweeter than you remembered it tasting as you signed the contract in front of you. You could be wrong. It had been a while since you'd been allowed a taste. Since that day, you started helping Victor with his work in his laboratory. 4 nights a week, you'd showed up at exactly 11 p.m. at the address your boss had provided. The only exception to this rule was when he'd message you in advance, asking you to buy things for him before you came in which case he'd asked you to try and be at the store within 10 minutes of 11 p.m. so you could bring in what he needed in a timely manner. To start, you were mostly asked for things that would be required of an assistant or an intern, except you were a highly paid intern, so you didn't exactly mind. He'd asked you to carry things around for him, to take notes whenever he was rambling aloud to himself about simple experiments he'd been performing, or to shop for him. You hadn't expected so many things that were available at the dollar store or at Walmart to be used by a man like him, but you decided pretty early on that you'd rather not ask questions you didn't want answers to. Whenever you had to spend time in his lab, there was yellow tape on the floor that very clearly indicated where you weren't meant to go. You couldn't really understand just from a quick look which breakers and test tubes were dangerous to you and which ones weren't. Once, while you were carrying in 2 bags filled to the brim with things he'd asked you to buy and were looking for a place to put it down, You'd almost crossed the tape in your distraction. Your toes had barely crossed over the yellow tape before a hand wrapped around your wrist and an arm wrapped around you, pulling you against a warm chest. Your body had tensed for a second before slowly relaxing back against Victor. Since your employer constantly wore those long lab coats that covered most of his body, you hadn't realized that there was a strength to him. But right now, wrapped tightly in his embrace, you could feel the muscles shifting under his clothes. He leaned closer, his breath warm against your ears as he whispered softly, "Careful. We wouldn't want you to lose a finger now, do we, darling? You have such lovely hands after all." As he said that, the fingers that had been gripping your wrist brushed against the back of your hand, making you shiver, as the arm wrapped around you and slowly moved down your waist. You took in a shaky breath, feeling as if you just run a marathon despite the fact that you were standing completely still. His words rendered you speechless and breathless for a few seconds. You could feel your heartbeat racing in your chest, making you feel warm all over. Once he was sure you wouldn't continue walking forward, he'd slowly let go of you after giving your waist a little squeeze. It hadn't been hard enough to hurt, but you could feel the warmth of his hand even after he let go. It was a bit surprising, truly, how sweet Victor could be when you were working with him. Whenever you handed him something he'd asked for, he'd always smile back and answer with a quick, "Thank you, dear." He then reached into his coat pocket and handed you another one of those candies. A part of you was pretty amused by the habit. You wanted to point out to the man that you weren't a child he needed to bribe into doing work. You were happy enough with the flow of candy coming your way for you to keep your mouth shut. You always ended your night with having tasted this familiar sweetness at least once. He normally tried to ask you about your day whenever you came to work. If he was already busy with the time-consuming experiment when you came in, he'd come to talk to you as soon as he was done. The small talk he did didn't feel probing, it felt caring. Like he genuinely wanted to know about your most recent family issues, or the latest debate you'd started with your friends over text. Victor especially seemed to show genuine worry when one time you showed up to work a little bit late. You weren't the type to show up late to work, even less becoming an employee to a man you pretty sure had killed people before. He might be nice to you, but you really didn't want to test how far his patience would go. "Are you alright?" he asked, carefully putting down the test tube filled with glowing pink liquid he'd been swirling. "You've never been late before. Did something happen?" You winced, trying to hold back a groan of annoyance. While you had told him about the issues that bothered you recently, they'd only been little things. Like how the coffee shop you went into didn't put the syrup you asked for in your coffee, or how your shoes got absolutely soaked when you misjudged the depths of a puddle you stepped in. There was a world of difference between explaining these little things to someone and telling them about something that genuinely bothered you to your core. Still, at the concerned look in those violet eyes, you relented and started to explain. "I ran into an ex on my way over here. It didn't go well." You sighed before shaking your head, making an odd jerky motion with your hands. "It's not like I'm over it at all. We broke up a while back, but it ended up in such a messy way I can't even look back fondly on all the good moments. Doesn't mean they had to be such an ass about it, though." You trailed off with a frown, clenching your fists as you took in a deep breath. You could feel frustrated tears starting to well up in your eyes, no matter how much you tried to push them away. You'd already cried way too much over that fuckwad, so you didn't want to give them the satisfaction of hurting you once more. The way they'd sneered when you locked eyes, however, it made something ache deep in your chest. Victor suddenly stepped closer, slowly reaching for your shoulder. He gave you every chance to step away from the touch before he squeezed it gently, rubbing his thumb in a soothing motion. "Hey, whoever that ex was, I can tell that person is a dick. You deserve better than have your night ruined just because of a little run-in. Tell you what, sweetheart, I'll take care of this mess later. For now, how about we simply order food and just hang out, yeah? We don't need to have a bad night just because of one awful person, now do we?" You took in another breath, offering Victor a little nod. Yeah, he was right. You were gonna have such a wonderful night no matter what. You'd broken up with that toxic shithead for a reason, and you weren't regretting that decision, thank you very much. You gave him a little grin, still sniffling slightly as you were calming down. The thought of some tasty food and spending the night with someone who truly wanted to listen to what you were saying, and who seemed to think that the things you were interested in mattered, was a much better thought than spending the rest of the night thinking of that little fuck. Suddenly, you felt Victor tug you a little bit closer before something soft and warm pressed against your forehead. It was a light, gentle thing that you might have assumed was a simple touch of his fingers if you hadn't felt his breath brush against your skin. Before you had the time to blink and think about the fact your evil boss had just kissed your forehead, the man had already stepped back, walking over to his phone so he could order some food. You stood there, a little bit dumbfounded as a soft, giddy warmth spread through your chest. You couldn't help the small, hopeful smile that appeared on your lips. Maybe tonight wouldn't be so much of a disaster after all. It was getting harder and harder to remember what kind of man Victor truly was, forgetting the fact he was your employer and that, even in a normal environment, you shouldn't be thinking about him so unprofessionally. You knew his experiments weren't for anything good. People were probably getting hurt because of the things you had helped him with, because of the things he created. However, that night, you managed to fully forget those facts. even if it was just for a little bit. He'd gotten Thai food delivered to the warehouse, with delivery people having long learned not to ask questions about where they were delivering, and you both simply talked for the rest of the evening. By the end of the night, you'd gotten more familiar with his laughter, and the way his eyes crinkled when he was thinking of something mischievous to say. Both of you were sitting on top of 2 work tables, having carefully moved away any notes or glass you could risk breaking. He gently kicked your feet at your bad jokes, snickering quietly with a shake of his head. At one point during the night, he'd lost the lab coat, letting it rest on the back of a chair. With the way his hair was still tied back, you could see a bit more of his tattoos like this, the ink tentacles climbing up his collarbones, going to hug the base of his neck. Your eyes had wandered down more than once, and you could swear that, whenever you ended looking back up, there was a little smug smirk on Victor's face. Something shifted between the two of you after that day, like a missing cog in the machine had been finally found and was slotted into place. You couldn't properly put your finger on what had changed at first. After all, it wasn't as if the man's attitude had done an entire 180 all of a sudden. It was more subtle than that. You noticed how tactile the scientist was now. Well, you thought he'd started to be more touchy, but you couldn't exactly pinpoint if he'd been like this since the beginning, or if that was a recent development. It was never anything inappropriate either. It was always little things. Little touches that left you shivering, and wondered if you simply imagined it. If you were slouching when he passed behind you, Victor would brush his fingers up along the length of your spine before putting his hand on your shoulder and straining you up. If something you'd done had pleased him, he'd smile just as much as he used to before, but now he'd also pat your back at the same time. The worst part about it all was the praises. They kept coming your way, making you feel unbalanced and flustered every time. How are you meant to keep your head clear and focused when the man kept complimenting you? Good job, sweetheart. I am so proud of you. Just keep doing that for me. Okay, darling? Even if there was nothing untoward happening, you could swear there was something in his eyes as he gazed down at you. The looks he gave you were filled with hunger sometimes, like he wanted to lay you out on the table and eat you right up. You'd seen the way his entire attention could be focused on a single thing when he focused on an experiment, but it felt different when that same level of attention was directed at you. His voice would become velvety when he spoke to you, warm and soft. You hadn't realized it wasn't his normal tone, since he'd always spoken to you that way. But you caught him on the phone once, and there was no care in the voice then. You weren't sure if you should feel special, or if that person on the other end of the line had been particularly bothersome. A few weeks after that evening spent on eating takeout instead of working, you received a phone call in the early afternoon. With how your new work schedule had you up at odd hours of the night, you had very quickly ended up sleeping during the day, so you could be awake and attentive at work. That meant while most people wouldn't be woken up by a phone call or two in the afternoon, you had still been in bed when your phone started to vibrate next to you. You had groggily reached out towards your phone, your voice still rough with sleep as you picked up without really checking the contact name. If it was a spam call, that would be a future problem for future you. Hello? You mumbled into the receiver as you pulled your blankets tighter around your body, trying to preserve some semblance of sleepiness so you could fall right back to sleep after answering whoever this was. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed up with a sharp intake of a breath. You frowned, ready to hang up before Victor's familiar deep voice came from your phone, sounding surprisingly breathless. Hi. Sorry to be waking you up, darling. I didn't think you'd be asleep at this hour. You let out a little humming sound as you finally sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from your eyes. Victor had called you once or twice before, asking you to bring something earlier during the day, and you were assuming that this was what this call was about. No, it's fine. You yawned. I can get up. There was a quiet chuckle on the other end that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That won't be necessary. I was in fact calling you to tell you your services won't be necessary for tonight. For a moment, you could almost swear you heard a familiar voice in the background, like there was someone yelling at the phone. You heard fabric rustling as Victor moved away from the noise, his voice much colder and rougher as he shushed whoever was on his end of the phone line. I thought I asked you to be quiet while I was talking here. Then, Victor moved the phone back to his cheek, addressing you once more. Apologies. I'm dealing with a mess that caused me a little bit of trouble today. You'll still get paid for the evening since I'm canceling on you last minute, of course. In fact, how about I send you a little extra so you can get yourself something nice to eat tonight? Alright? Before you could say anything in return, he quickly cut in once again, a grin in his voice. I'll see you tomorrow at the usual time. Bye-bye, darling. And then he hung up. You stared at your phone for a few minutes before sighing and flopping back into bed. You were definitely paid enough for this, but at the moment you found that you didn't really care about what was happening there. Maybe a contract had gone bad, maybe there was an actual villain talking to Victor at the moment. What mattered was that you could get a couple more hours of sleep, and you didn't need to get dressed for the day. As promised, Victor sent you the equivalent of your usual salary that night, and also added over $100 on top of it. When you received the notification, you stared blankly at your phone, unsure if you should inform the man that this was definitely more than you usually spend on food. You probably might have, if you hadn't sounded so busy on the phone earlier. Probably. You really did appreciate the money. As a thank you, you showed up the next day with 2 drinks in hand, knowing the scientist had a tendency to forget water was a thing when he got really invested in a project. While you weren't bringing him a water bottle, a nice iced tea was better than nothing. When you entered the warehouse, you stopped and frowned for a moment at the sharp smell of cleaning products that filled up the space. It wasn't the first time you smelled strong scents when walking in there, especially with the many products Victor used on a daily basis, but it was the first time you'd been hit in the face with the scent of bleach. You quickly looked around the lab, wanting to make sure there hadn't been a chemical spill or something similar that the scientists might have not spotted yet, before your eyes stopped on a darker patch on the floor. You could have sworn there hadn't been a stain there before. Is that for me? A little gasp escaped your lips as you quickly turned around to look at Victor, who was standing right behind you. Your heart raced in your chest, beating hard even as you took a deep breath to make yourself relax. "You scared me," he snickered quietly, mirth shining in his eyes as he reached forward to grab his drink order from your hand. "What? Little old me managed to scare such a strong, competent person. I can hardly believe it, my darling." You huffed, feeling your cheeks warming up as you gave a slight swat to his arm. You took a sip of your own drink before answering him. "You know exactly what you're doing, you ass." As you felt your heart finally starting to beat normally once again, your eyes settled on something reflecting light on one of the work tables. You frowned, realizing that a very familiar novelty lighter was laying there, as if it had been forgotten there. It had a very specific look to it, and your mind immediately flashed back to the last person who you'd seen using a lighter like this one. Your ex. Following your gaze, Victor's eyes settled on the lighter too. It was an almost icy look to him for a second before he relaxed once again, giving you that charismatic smile you were used to. "Do you like it?" he asked calmly as he sauntered over to pick it up, spinning the lighter between his fingers. "An acquaintance of mine found it at a pawn shop and decided to give it to me." The thought of your ex, who had been fiercely possessive over everything they'd considered theirs, from their possessions all the way to the people in their lives, getting rid of this prized item felt a bit out of character. But then again, it wasn't as if it was necessarily a one-of-a-kind lighter. It could be possible for someone else to find one. It's just, if you had a nickel for every time someone who you'd cared about in your life had this lighter, you'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it was extremely weird that it happened twice. "I don't really like it," you carefully answered, your nose wrinkling despite yourself. Victor smiled in response, letting the lighter fall into a nearby trash can without a second of hesitation. "Me neither." You tried to push the lighter out of your mind as you were tugged away from it, the man going back on a rant about an experiment he'd been trying to adjust so it could have the specific effects he was looking for. It wasn't something worth thinking about. The tension that had been slowly building between the two of you finally snapped less than a week later. You'd been working in the lab by yourself, humming under your breath as you mixed ingredients. Victor had taught you how to make basic mixtures he could use for himself later on. Nothing that had a serious risk of explosion, of course, but it was at least more entertaining than filling out paperwork for the man. It was a normal Tuesday night. The sky was a little cloudy, and it was pretty mild out. You could hear Victor looking for something on the small loft on the warehouse's second floor. It was just another day, which is why when you heard an accented voice coming in from the front door, you couldn't help but be startled. "Dr. Leachborn," called out the stranger as she stepped forward into the room. Then, her gaze slowly went through the room, clearly searching for Victor before it settled on you. With the mask covering most of her face and the costume she was wearing, her only recognizable features were her eyes. They seemed startlingly pale against the black leather she was wearing. She tilted her head to the side, looking you up and down with clear curiosity before she smiled with all her teeth. There was something a little bit unsettling about the way she was looking at you, like she had just found an interesting bug on the floor, and she was trying to figure out whether she wanted to crush it underneath her heel or put it outside. "Oh, hello," she started, a light lilt to her voice. "And who might you be?" Before you could say anything, a shadow appeared behind your back. You could feel a hand grabbing your wrist, dragging you back roughly. You winced in pain, gasping quietly as you looked back up at the man who had stepped in front of you. Victor's entire body was tense in a way you'd never seen before. His callous fingers were squeezing you, holding on more strongly than ever. His eyes almost seemed to glow as he glared at the stranger, looking like he was seriously considering murder. "Leachborn," smiled the stranger, sounding almost giddy. "I was looking for you. Did you finish what I'd requested the other night? I was thinking we should—" "Dames," cut in Victor with a hiss, his voice low and menacing. "I thought I made myself pretty clear that no one was to bother me on some days. I sent a very detailed calendar to you and the others." She crossed her arms, cocking her head to the side as a strand of curly hair fell over her eyes, slipping from beneath her hood. There was a small pout to her lips as she whined almost childishly. Something was itching in the back of your mind. Dames. You'd heard this name before, hadn't you? "I just thought you were busy. I didn't think you were hiding such a cute piece of—" "Dames." She raised her hands with a chuckle, slowly taking a step back. A cute little jingle resonated in the tense room. The sound continued to repeat again and again until the stranger slowly reached down into her pocket, pulling out her phone. Your eyes followed the movement, settling on her screen when it was finally out in the open. You'd never seen a phone quite like that. The design was sleek and simple, with a little rabbit head logo with pierced ears in the back of it. You could barely read a G in the contact's name before she quickly clicked the screen and the ringing went silent once more. Well, business calls, babes. You know the drill. Call me back with news about the bombs when you're done with them. You know we're very interested in them. She winked at Victor before leaning to the side and giving you a friendly wave. Her smile was just as sharp as before, but she'd seemingly decided that you weren't to be crushed. Then she spun around on her heels, happily walking out of the warehouse. That was another moment of tense silence before you slowly opened your mouth. Victor, you're kind of hurting me. The second you pointed that out, he quickly released his grip on your wrists. However, he just as quickly grabbed your shoulders, pushing you until your lower back hit the edge of the table behind you. His eyes were quickly looking you up and down, inspecting every visible inch of skin he could see. There was something in those violet eyes, like a glint of manic worry. Are you alright? She didn't touch you, did she? You quickly shook your head, a bit surprised at how genuinely distressed he seemed to be at the thought that you had been left alone with that person for a minute or two. No, she didn't touch me. You tried to reassure him. Slowly, you reached up to him, brushing your fingers against his cheek. His eyes fluttered shut at the touch, his frame relaxing slightly. Victor took in a shuddering breath, his body slumping forward slightly. He turned his head to the side, pressing a soft kiss to the palm of your hand. When you let out a little gasp at the sudden warmth, his eyes opened once more. Your gazes locked together when he kissed the inside of your hand again. Then slowly, he took hold of the wrist with which you'd been cradling his face. He turned your hand up and continued his sweet kisses down to your wrist, then kept going down your arm, dragging his fingers alongside it. A shiver ran down your spine. Your breathing was a bit shaky and uncertain as you looked at each other for a tense moment. Fire was burning in your veins, heating you up in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room you two were in. The tenuous peace between the two of you had shattered in what seemed to be an instant. You barely had any time to process what was happening before you quickly surged forward, smashing your lips together. It wasn't gentle or soft, but rather something powered by the pure, desperate thought of losing you. The metal ring on his bottom lip was skin warm and solid against the softness of his skin. Your body was pressed harder against the table as he shifted forward until he was towering over you. You'd felt the hidden strength beneath his clothes before, but you very rarely felt it on yourself. Something warm swiped across your lips, bringing out a strangled little cry from your throat. Victor took this opportunity for his tongue to breach your lips, pulling you closer to his chest. His grip was getting rougher once again, as if he was afraid you'd try to escape his hold on you. However, the second you pressed a hand against his chest to get some space, you almost immediately backed away, letting go abruptly and taking a few steps back. You were both breathing hard as you looked at each other. The wild-eyed look he was giving you almost felt like a reflection of how you were feeling, like he was surprised at his own behavior. He frowned, reaching out towards you before clenching his fist tightly. His nails were biting into his palm, his shoulders shaking a bit. You hesitated for a moment before reaching up to the scientist once again. Your hand was hanging in the air for less than a second, and then you felt his fingers wrap around yours, holding on gentler than before. You started, your breath still ragged. Just needed a second to catch my breath, Vic. I wasn't saying no. He stared at you for a second, a glint appearing in his eyes as a small smile slowly curled up in his lips. Victor leaned forward, pressing a quick kiss to your lips before he whispered, close enough that you could feel his breath against your skin. Was that a yes then? You gave him a quick nod in answer, but it didn't seem to satisfy him. He leaned down, pressing kisses to your neck. It dragged a yelp out of your lips as you quickly reached up, burying your fingers in his hair. I'm gonna need your words, sweetheart. He was almost pleading. You could feel his words against your skin, sending goosebumps down your arms. Please, I want to know if you want this as much as I do. You distractedly tugged at his hair, pulling a quiet groan out of his mouth. You could feel your face burning up, warm enough that you were certain you could feel it from this close. It took you a moment before you quickly answered. Yes. Yeah. I want it to. The look in his eyes as he straightened up over you once more punched a breathless sound out of you, like you'd given him the right to eat from you until there was nothing left, until your head was empty of anything except the thought of him. He smiled as he quickly pressed kisses all over your face, your forehead, then your eyelids as they fluttered shut, the tip of your nose, and finally, your lips once again. You could feel his smile against your own, a little surprised laugh escaping you at the onslaught of affection. Darling, he breathed out against your skin. My beautiful, wonderful, darling. His fingers were slowly brushing against the side of your body. His touch was barely there, light as a feather, but you could still feel it like a burning brand against your soul. The second they reached the back of your thighs, Victor quickly hauled you up so you could sit on the edge of the table. The sound of shattering glass rang out as a vial was accidentally shoved to the ground. You gasped, trying to get a look at what you had just broken, but the scientist quickly grabbed your face, pressing your lips together. His fingers gently nudged your knees apart so you could step between your legs. Your bodies pressed together, entangling with one another like two pieces of a puzzle, finally slotting in one another. Vic, you tried between two passionate kisses that made your head spin. The glass, the man smiled against your lips, like he knew something you didn't. It's your workstation, he answered as his fingers brushed against your hips, gently tugging at the hem of your shirt. I never gave you anything actually dangerous. Don't worry, you gasped, pulling back enough to be able to look him in the eyes. He had an almost frenzied look to him, with his hair untied. His lab coat was starting to slip off his shoulders, the shirt beneath it cut low enough to expose the tattoos across his collarbones. You unconsciously licked your lips at the sight, only realizing you'd done so when his eyes were suddenly fixed on your mouth. You gave him a little smack on his arm, rolling your eyes in fond amusement. You're such an ass, you know that? Victor cooed back at you, grinning as he leaned forward once again. It was like your lips were attracting him, like he was pulled to your mouth the same way a planet might be caught in the gravity of a sun, burning hot and relenting. What are you gonna do about it, sweetheart? You tried to glare at him, but it was a bit hard to look vexed when his fingers were slipping beneath your shirt, brushing against the soft skin beneath the fabric. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed of himself, so you simply decided to use what you had at your disposal and tugged at his hair, hard. A little whimper escaped his lips, clear and bright in the mostly empty warehouse. You two blinked at each other before Victor grinned even more. Threatening me with a good time isn't as much of a threat as you seem to believe it is. Before you could argue in return, he finally kissed you once again, swallowing up your words. Truly, it was hard to be annoyed at the man when he was so adept at brushing any of those thoughts with a simple kiss. A simple touch. Just as his hands were slowly moving up, tugging at your shirt in little motions, you quickly let go of his hair, in favor of pushing that lab coat off his shoulders. There was something almost satisfying in seeing the always crisp and perfect white fabric crumple to the floor. Physical proof that you could fluster the man as much as he could fluster you. In the end, Victor managed to pull your shirt above your head before you could so much as begin to tug at his. His eyes flickered across your body, taking in the expanse of skin now revealed. He took in a shaky breath, his hands hovering over you for a moment. You are simply divine, my dear, whispered Victor as his mouth connected back to your neck, kissing down the length of it. One of your hands reached back up to the back of his shirt, tugging up at it as you let your head fall back to give him more room to work with. You were in the process of trying to get the fabric off his chest so you could touch him too when you felt teeth grazing your throat. You couldn't help the surprised little whimper that left your mouth. There had been a moment where Victor had seemed almost terrifying, when you couldn't separate the man holding you close right now and the Dr. Leechborn that apparently supplied bombs to villains. However, even as you felt the threat of his teeth over your jugular, you felt no fear, only a mix of molten hot pleasure and desire. There was no danger in the safety of his arms, only the knowledge that this man loved you enough to be terrified at the thought that another villain had even laid eyes on you. Maybe you should be a bit concerned at such clear possessive behavior, but the thought of it simply sent a rush through you. There was clearly something wrong with your brain, but you couldn't find it in yourself to care about which wires had gotten crossed to get you to think like that. That train of thought was quickly derailed by the wonderful feeling of lips, and teeth, and tongue, pressing against the junction between your neck and shoulder. Then you fucking finally managed to pull his shirt over his head, throwing it down at the ground, leaving it to join the lab coat on the warehouse floor. Your eyes lit up as you stared at his bare chest, the piercings glinting at his nipples making your mouth feel dry. Fuck, you mumbled under your breath, the slip of the tongue sounding infinitely louder in the silence. Victor blinked before laughing, his smile as bright as the sun on a winter's day. I hope that was a nice fuck. I would hate to disappoint. You smiled a bit sheepishly, shivering as his hand squeezed your waist. It was definitely a good reaction. Well, if you like those piercings, I'm sure you're going to appreciate the other ones I have. The scientist trailed off, giving you a cocky smile. Before you could ask what he meant by that, he pressed his hips against yours, making you groan. Your hips twitched almost instinctively, unable to help yourself from trying to grind up against the hard length pressing against you. Oh, you breathed out, words escaping you for a moment. Yeah, oh, grinned the man, leaning forward to swallow up any other sounds you might make in the softness of his lips. The next morning, you weren't sure if it was the general soreness of your body that woke you up, or the sun shining through the high windows. A warm body was pressed up next to you under a thin blanket that clearly wasn't meant to cover two people. Fingers brushed up and down your spine, making you shiver. When you leaned into your living body pillow, a warm laugh came from the man lying next to you. Good morning to you too, my dear, whispered Victor, his voice sounding rough in the morning light. You slowly opened your eyes, a part of you wanting to crash right back down into the sweet embrace of sleep. As your sight finally managed to clear enough to look at the patch of skin right next to your face, you frowned for a moment at the obvious bruises. Bite marks and hickeys were peppered across the man's shoulder, standing out proudly against his skin. You'd probably feel a little bit bad if you couldn't feel on your own skin how they'd definitely been reciprocated. A little satisfied smirk was the first thing you saw when your eyes slowly trailed up. You gave Victor a little kick, making him chuckle quietly, his voice much more gentle than the look on his face. What? I can't be happy that I finally have you in my arms? Not if you're gonna be so fucking smug about it, you mumbled in response, snuggling up closer to him despite your whining. You both stayed quiet for a moment as Victor started stroking your back once again. It was nice, really. This quiet, gentle moment between the two of you. You were close to falling back to sleep when the scientist broke the silence once more. I'm sorry if I scared you yesterday. A frown found its way to your face as you gave him a little inquiring hum in answer. Victor sighed, shifting slightly to be able to press a gentle kiss against your forehead. With dames, I mean, Victor started to explain. I am a contractor for a few separate private investors around the world. Since I respect my privacy and yours, I asked them not to show up when I had you scheduled to help me around the lab. You couldn't help but snicker. More like you make inventions for villains, Victor. He hummed noncommittally as a simple answer. Something like that. The rest of the day was just as sweet and slow, like syrup being slowly poured down your throat until all your thoughts were as sweet as sugar. You didn't exactly know how it happened since Victor seemed to be more than happy to hide your relationship, your entire existence away from the other villains operating in the city, but apparently they learned of the fact that you two were a thing now. When he'd informed you of that fact, Victor unhappily blamed Dames for the entire thing. A part of you was a tad bit curious about whatever happened between the two of them, for your lover to be so unbelievably unhappy with her, but you didn't care to ask. You figured this was the type of question you could only ask after dating someone for a while. One day, right before you were due to walk into work, because you still helped Victor with his job, even if most of your evenings ended up with the two of you making out at least once, your phone vibrated in your pocket. A small frown appeared on your face when you recognized the contact name. It was the same acquaintance who had suggested you to go meet Victor for a job interview. It took you a moment before you quickly clicked to open the notification. Instead of a quick, hello, how are you? Or, are you planning on coming into the party this weekend? You were presented with a wall of text. Your eyes quickly scanned over the words before you stopped yourself and started back at the beginning, feeling your stomach drop. Hey look, I know we don't know each other very well, so I'm going to be keeping this brief and to the point. Not that I'm admitting to anything, but I've been running in the same circles as your boyfriend. I ended up owing him a small favor a while back, so when he asked me to offer you a job, I didn't ask questions and I just did it. I thought it was just a job, fuck it. Maybe you had merits I didn't know about that could help him with an invention or something. But I just learned from Dames that the two of you were dating now and I couldn't just keep quiet. I just felt like you should know about the fact he asked for you. It wasn't a coincidence you met him. You stared at your screen for a long moment, feeling your heart racing in your chest. Your free hand started to curl into a fist, your nails digging hard in your skin, leaving behind tiny indents. Your body almost felt like it was on autopilot as you stepped inside the warehouse, phone in hand. Victor turned around, looking up at you with a happy smile that rapidly vanished when he saw whatever look you had on your face. He frowned, tilting his head to the side, looking almost like a confused puppy for a moment. Fucking asshole. You shoved your phone in his face, glaring up at him. Your hands were almost shaking with anger. Is this real? Seriously, you manipulated me into working here. The scientist stared down at the screen for a moment, quietly reading it. Slowly, his face turned blank as he looked back at you, emotions impossible to read in those deep violet eyes. What if it's real? Asked Victor with a slight shrug, shoving a hand into his lab coat pocket. I never said I was interviewing other people. It isn't my fault you assumed I was. You scoffed, anger burning in your chest. You let your phone fall down on the table your lover had pushed you against the first time you two had ended up tangled into bed together, before reaching up to grab him by the collar. You were unfucking believable. Why the hell did you think manipulating me like this was necessary? Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know the kind of man you are? I've seen the results of your inventions out in the city. I've seen the barely clean bloodstains on your warehouse floor. I've heard you trying to get information out of somebody through the headphones you gave me. I know you're not an innocent, sweet angel, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't treat me like I'm a naive child, Victor. The man blinked, looking at you in clear surprise. Then carefully, as if he was stepping on eggshells, he asked, You aren't upset with me? You squinted up at him, gripping his collar a bit tighter. I'm upset you lied to me. Never do that again or I will use one of your inventions against you. Don't think I won't. Victor smiled at you, wrapping his arms around your body and pulling you in tight. One day, you were gonna slap the grin off of his face. Oh baby, talk dirty to me. That did make you roll your eyes as he pressed soft kisses to your face. You let him have his way, a glimmer of fondness shimmering in the depths of your chest. Yeah, there were definitely a few cross wires in your mind. And when Victor pulled a candy out of his coat pocket, making your mouth water instinctively, you definitely slapped his arm this time.